Hello, and welcome to this overview episode of the Castrati Chronicles. I'm your host, Morven Hawthorne. A small note before we start. This podcast is being produced as part of an EPQ project and will contain adult themes and medical descriptions. This episode will give you a brief overview of the history and its ideas around the existence of the castrati. After establishing what a castrato is, I will be joined by experts in their fields to discuss the castrati's origins, careers in the church, careers in opera, and our modern reflections on this cultural practice. So what is a castrato? A castrato is simply a male singer who is being castrated before puberty. A castrato is a type of eunuch, and a eunuch is an umbrella term for a man whose genitals have been mutilated in a range of different ways. Although the castrati have their basis in Byzantine Constantinople, their metaphorical golden age was in the early 17th century to the 18th century, as key figures such as Farinelli became the heroes of opera and the angels of the Sistine Chapel. For the rest of our time together, I will be giving a brief history of the castrati, the world around the castrati in their heyday, their role in the church and opera, and their legacy today. For more in-depth detail, there is a reading list on our website. Starting in the ancient civilization of Sumer, the first records we have of human castration date back to the 21st century BCE, in a city which is now called Lagash in modern-day Iraq. This theory largely comes from the Roman historian Amalius Marcellus, writing in the 4th century. He believed that male castration had its origins during the reign of Cimmerius, an Assyrian queen, and demonstrates the Roman view of the East being inferior and barbaric. However, more recent research has shown that in Mesopotamia, eunuchs have a considerably earlier history. Images from the 4th millennia BC have been found in Uruk and are associated with the Sumerian goddess Inanna, the goddess of sexual love and fertility. They display few human figures of 3 distinct varieties: men, women, and a group lacking hair and genitals. Although hard to pinpoint whether these figures are eunuchs, anthropologist Susan Pollock has referred to them as genderless figures. Yet, looking to the later uses of the eunuch can potentially provide us with answers. Castration in both Chinese and Muslim courts was popular as it allowed men of the royal households to guard women whilst ensuring that they would not get pregnant by the staff. Getting back to the topic of music, the first records that we have of castrated men being specifically used for their singing voices is in Constantinople during the rise of the Byzantine Empire. The castrati took a key role in liturgical chants and most likely took roles as professional musicians within churches and potential courts. So, how did they get to Italy? Patrick Barbaro writes that it's thought that castration took its place in music in Spain. A group of eunuchs in the Mozarabic civilization in the 12th century gradually won considerable places in the Catholic liturgy. A papal bull issued by Sixtus V provides quite clearly that castrati had been admitted for a long time in principal churches in the Iberian Peninsula. However, a recurring issue is that we do not know whether these men were real castrato or just very, very good falsetto singers. This led to a turning point at the end of the 16th century, which led to the use of the castrati in Rome. Although the Vatican archives do not mention them, it is highly likely that Francisco Sotto and Giacomo Spagnoletto were true castrati. Taking an interlude from our timeline, you might be thinking, was this just an accepted part of society? Who performed the surgeries? Who was castrated? Although the first question is hard to answer, in one way yes, and in many ways no, certain popes were so taken with the voices of the castrati, as seen with Guillermo Rossini and Pope Clementine VIII, that they were willing to overlook the ethical questions surrounding the practice. But on the whole, castration was condemned through numerous papal bulls. Many were disgusted with the practice, such as philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau called them the most gloomy actors in the world. However, they also ended up being somewhat of a tourist attraction. So, how did this happen? Why were young boys castrated? Here's someone who knows a lot more to tell you about it.
No, there's a few different reasons as to why this occurred in history. So, first of all, the first castrati are reported at a period in time when women are banned from singing in Catholic churches. There is a piece in church canon that says that women shall be silent, and that means that they were not permitted to be singing. But in the Catholic Church, singing very high polyphonic music was a staple. It's a staple of choral music to this day. And so they were relying on young boys to be able to carry those very complex high lines. The trouble is that as soon as you've got a boy to the point where he's so well trained that he can sing those lines, you're maybe only got about 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years if you're lucky, before that voice is gone, because they're going to grow into a man.
Yeah.
And so at some point, someone figured out that, hey, if we stop that process by removing the genitalia before they hit puberty, they're going to maintain those high voices and will never have to lose that voice again. In fact, it will get stronger and more powerful, and they'll continue training and they'll be able to sing even more complex music. So that's one reason. Another reason is that in Italy, around about the 17th and 18th century, the country was extremely poor and a lot of families were really struggling with famine. It's a Catholic country and lots of families had lots and lots of children. And the problem with that is that, well, while some children may pass due to natural causes, the ones that survive, there's very few industries for them to actually go into. And so an alternative is to gift them to the church or pin your hopes on them becoming a celebrity singer. And that means allowing them to go through the castration process. If you have a few sons, then you've already got sons to carry on your family name, so you can give up one or two to castration.
The operation itself was usually done by barbers if an illness could not be faked. Rumours flew across Europe that there were signs across Italian cities saying, "Castrations for the papal choir done here." Due to the possibility of hemorrhaging, the operation was incredibly risky and was usually performed on boys in between 7 and 12 years old. Here's Dr. Hawthorne to tell us more.
So back in the 17th century, when you were wishing to effectively castrate a young boy, and it was usually done around the age of 8 or 9, you're not trying to inflict some form of punishment or pain. And so from the point of view of controlling, did it hurt, physicians had available poppy juice, or effectively a derivative of the poppy similar to morphine, and they could administer that. In addition to that, you could also administer alcohol as a form of reducing consciousness level and trying to minimize the distress to the young boy. Of course, it would vary from physician to physician. Some might be kinder than others.
Surgeons at the time would do anything that they could to reduce the risk of infection, and this led to some creative methods of surgery. Here's a warning for surgical descriptions.
At that time, all surgery was plagued by the risk of infection. And so techniques which could achieve what you wanted to achieve without cutting the skin and leaving the person open to invasion from bacteria and infection and consequently possibly even death were much more favoured. One of the techniques here was to take the testicle literally between the thumb and the finger and squeeze it until it literally ruptured. So it became a squishy little thing inside the scrotum. In other words, that you couldn't actually feel it. So it would cause bleeding and it would cause swelling, but not sufficient that the skin would be ruptured and there would be a risk of infection. And obviously you'd do that to both testicles. The other way was to use a tool where you would feel for the spermatic cord as it enters the scrotum. You would place the spermatic cord with the skin surrounding it into basically what was a kind of thing that looked like a nutcracker, and you would squeeze very hard, and that would seriously damage the blood supply to the testicle and the vas deferens, the tube that conducts the semen, the sperm, from the testicle. You wanted to cut off the blood supply because it was the blood supply which circulated the testosterone in the body, and so that the testosterone would have its effects on the tissues. And if you could clot off the artery that fed the testicle and cut off the veins that drained the testicle, effectively you stopped testosterone production. Open surgery is really something which was considered not part of the world of the castrati. Open surgery was something that you go back to the Byzantine Empire, you go back to the Iranian Empire, Persian Empire, where often this kind of thing was sometimes inflicted as on a punishment of to a family, where a rival lord would not want his rival family to reproduce, and in that situation you would be looking at a much more brutal form of neutralizing the man.
Whilst there are claims that some singers were natural castrati, these are almost certainly false. Personified in the story of a singer called Bellini, he believed that he was born with an empty scrotum. However, was proved wrong when, in the middle of a performance, his balls are said to have dropped. It is not very clear where these boys came from. Firstly, as Dr. Kirkland Robertson said, we know they usually came from families with multiple sons, as they would not want to risk the line not being carried on. Related to this, it is unlikely they came from high-class families, although there are records of famous musicians' sons being castrated. Looking at the correlation between inflation and the rough increase in castrations at a hospital in Florence, we can assume it was most likely poorer families which were willing to take the risk for fame and fortune. The church formed the backbone of the castrati's existence, with the papal choir containing castrati from the start of the 16th century up to the end of World War I. However, the church's relationship with the castrati remains a complex one. The belief in mulier al cita coro, women must remain absent from church choir, comes from 1 Corinthians 14:34. Women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. This meant that polyphonic melodies and harmony started to become popular in Western music, and higher voices were needed. Although many popes did speak out against castration, such as Leopold XIII and Clementine IV, there was an obvious turn in the 18th century in terms of attitude. Many were simply fascinated by their voices. Clementine VIII had replaced all falsetto sopranos with castrati by 1625, and the castrati became affiliated with the imagery of angels and cherubs over time. In terms of music, many popular choral works are believed to have been written with the castrati in mind. Miserere, written by Vittorio, who was believed to be a castrato himself, inspired Allegri's version, which is easily my favourite choral work. By the start of the 1700s, operas such as Monteverdi's Orfeo and Mozart's The Shepherd King required the hero to have a high soprano voice and were written for the castrati. Payments within the church remained far below those made to the singers in opera, and this prompted the churches to up their rates for the castrati. The papal states were different from other countries as they made constant use of the castrati in women's roles, and there are records that some women in Rome dressed in disguise in order to escape the ban given by Clementine XI on women singing. The effect of the transition of the castratis at opera was that it made these men celebrities across Europe, as they would be employed in London, Paris, and Vienna. the most famous of which is arguably Farinelli. His real name was Carlo Maria Broschi, and he was born to a family of wealthy musicians and was castrated by his older brother after the death of their father. Farinelli had an extraordinary talent and was said to have been able to sing without breath for a whole minute and was a master of passage work and ornamentation. After touring and performing in Vienna and London and being challenged by Handel's opera company, Farinelli began to gain royal influence. After being named chamber musician to Philip V of Spain, Ferdinand VI grew closer to Farinelli, and he never sang again in public. Another interesting figure is Venanzio Rauzzini, and here is someone who knows a lot more about him to tell you more.
So what I've been doing through my research is looking at one particular castrato. His name was Venanzio Rauzzini, and he has a unique story because he left Italy. He lived for a long time in Munich, where he worked at the court there. And then he came to Britain and he settled for the rest of his life in Britain and made a very good career for himself as a musician. And he was able to build a career around being a music teacher, which is something that we often also don't hear about very much. We'll hear about celebrity singers all the time, but not necessarily about what they do after they're a celebrity. So this really goes back to when I was an undergraduate student and I was singing a lot of Mozart repertoire, and I came across this singer called Nancy Storace, or Nancy Starace, as she preferred to be known. And she was one of the youngest singers to be performing. She actually premiered the role of Susanna when she was still a teenager. And so I was fascinated by her story, and I wanted to know, well, why was she so young and already performing these fabulous roles on stage? And then I came across the fact that she was trained by this teacher who was a castrato, and his name was Venanzio Rauzzini. And that brought me then to realizing that even though she'd been a celebrity singer in Italy, she'd actually originally come from Britain. Her family were based in London, and that's where she had met Rauzzini and where she had trained with him before going on to her continental career. So that's really how I came to know Rauzzini. It was through a celebrity singer. And he was also a celebrity singer as well. He was just a celebrity singer in his younger years. And then when he became a little bit older, he transitioned into other forms of music making.
One element of the lives of the castrati, which has gained a lot of attention, is their sex lives. Usually played for laughs, this is because there was such an element of mystery around what these men really did in the bedroom. As well as this, there was an element of fear, with the risk being that women would not get pregnant, so the act could be done without evidence. When the castrati started to become music teachers, this added fuel to the fire.
There's often literature that paints the music master as this person who could potentially be ending up in relationships with their students, whether they're doing it deliberately or with the intention of wanting to have that kind of relationship, or they just happen to fall in love. So we see this in Dangerous Liaisons. We see it in lots of different media narratives that happen in the 18th century, and it's still a narrative that exists really today. Most recently in Bridgerton, we saw that relationship between a singer and the elite man falling in love with one another, but the relationship can never be.
This androgynous sexuality has always been attractive, reflected in figures such as Prince and David Bowie. Famous castrati had a fandom around them which could be compared to the Beatlemania of the 1960s. For example, Marcheschi fans were known to wear medallions of his face around their necks, and, at his last performance, women are said to have wept bitterly, and many people found this sight as entertaining as the actual performance. Caffarelli was also famed for having affairs with married noblewomen, and hiding in wells to prevent being caught. However, castrati themselves were forbidden from being married in a 1587 papal bull. Yet, this did not stop figures such as Tenducci, who taught Mozart to sing for a year in London. He married a Protestant from Limerick in 1766, and they got married with a lot of complications, but the scandal hit when the marriage fell apart due to the birth of a child.
There was only one castrato who did manage to get married very briefly. His name was Giusto Tenducci, He was only married for a short time, and it was in a Protestant it was in a Protestant church where he got married, but there was a lot of speculation about how that was legal, and there was a lot of questions about that particular marriage. Then it ended up all breaking up because she mysteriously got pregnant.
Well, yes, we know it probably wasn't Tinducci.
It was not Tinducci. It was likely the person that she went on to marry very shortly after she skipped him.
These relationships with women also transpired as fearsome competitions throughout the 1700s. Prima donnas' names would be listed below the primo uomo on the bills, and for a while the castrati did not even see female sopranos as competition. However, this did not last. So, why did the castrati fall from grace? There had always been opposition to the existence of the castrati, especially within France. This movement was strong within that of the philosophers. Arguably, none were as adverse to the practice as Voltaire in works such as Candide. Voltaire remarked that the sight of a eunuch warbling in the roles of Caesar and Cato and walking about the stage in a clumsy fashion was one of the most abhorrent things that he'd ever seen. This opinion started to spread throughout Europe, accompanied by an awareness of the ethical problems accompanying castration. Composers stopped writing parts for the castrati, as the tenor replaced them as the part of the hero in works such as The Barber of Seville. This coincided with the Pope removing the long-standing ban on women performing in the Papal States in 1798. The castrati disappearing in opera did not mean that they were removed from churches or cathedrals, and choir schools in the Papal States continued to receive castrati. It took until 1870 for the practice to be totally banned. The last castrato to sing in the Sistine Chapel choir, Alessandro Moreschi, was estimated to have been castrated in around 1865, and by 1702, Pope Leopold XIII granted a request and pronounced that the castrati were never to be used again in church music. Moreschi's voice was recorded in 1902 in Rome by Will and Fred Gaisberg, and we are extremely lucky to still have this recording of him singing Ave Maria. As you listen to it, reflect on everything that we've spoken about today, the pain that went into its creation, and how it was once the most sought after sound on earth. So, what legacy have these men left behind, and what lessons can we learn from them? Here's what our guests think. What do you think for you in the medical world is the legacy of the castrati?
Well, of course, it was, if you like, a culturally created scientific experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And science today has been looking back at that experiment in the sense that actual bodies of castrati have been exhumed to examine what the condition and the deprivation of testosterone did to the skeleton, particularly in old age. So it's opportunities to learn and apply that learning to modern medicine in relation to endocrinology, and particularly the management of conditions such as prostate cancer, where you will wish to reduce testosterone production because of the role of testosterone in stimulating prostate cancer. And if you can learn how to protect somebody from the lack of testosterone whilst they're undergoing care and treatment for certain conditions, you can learn a lot from this, how would I put it, early modern era scientific but culturally led experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So there has been quite a bit of research and discussion on castrati by scholars, but I guess the key thing to highlight is that it was a phenomenon that existed in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. It no longer exists today. And we can learn quite a lot about why they existed, and we can learn quite a lot by recognizing that the practices of how they were created, we now consider those to be barbaric and wrong. But actually, there are certain practices in today's 21st century that you would say is very similar to castration. So promoting unhealthy image values and placing that on people, forcing them to then think that surgery is an option. And even though a lot of that is very safe today, it's still essentially doing the same thing that they were doing in the 18th century with the castrati, of creating something that is unattainable any other way, other than going through a surgical process. So I think we can learn a lot about that, and learn that this is something that happened in the past historically, that has affected opera, it has changed singing tuition. And if we learn more about those origins, we can actually learn more about why we do things the way that we do, and change them if the practices aren't suiting.
The music they were singing is still being performed today, and is now performed by women in cross-dressing roles, or modern-day countertenors, such as the extremely talented Philippe Jaworski. The film Farinelli, released in 1994, in which the director Gérard Gorbeau had the job of recreating the voice of the castrati, and capturing the life and rise of the singer with very little historical evidence. Gorbeau created the voice of Farinelli by mixing together women's voices with that of young boys. However, the reality is we will never truly know how these men sounded. The existence of the castrati, in my opinion, tells us how far we'll go in order to create acts for art, regardless of ethics. The creation of the castrati creates a dark edge to the classical period, and one which can act as a cautionary tale. But I leave you with this, as Anthony Milner poses in his article Sacred Cocoons: whether the desire to create an accurate recreation of Baroque classical music, would the castrati be reborn? Thank you so much for listening. Before I finish, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who helped me with this project, from those in schools to our highly esteemed guests. The bibliography and the reading list for this podcast will be available at morvenhawthorne.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening.